going to be able. Good to know. I'm not going to be able to acknowledge everybody that I should tonight because there are lots of acknowledgements. But what I will say is that we've lost that one. Can we go back one? Yes. But this shows the complex pretty much as it is now, with the manor house inside a moat dating back to the 14th century, and then an outer court next to it with 3 buildings in it: the great barn, the little barn, imaginatively labelled, and the granary. And although it's been enhanced since that was taken, and the red line shows the scheduled area around it. So what we were taken on to do, do I go forward? Yes, that's the best way, was to monitor the digging of all these trenches. And I think everyone who was involved thought that it would be pretty low key, including myself. I'd like to thank various people for giving me the opportunity to do this work. The Headstone Manor restoration project was undertaken under the leadership of Jo Saunders, and later her successors were Alison Torbit, and the current incumbent looking after the museum is Kerry Blackburn. We were the project was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, without which we wouldn't have got the dosh to do it. And I'd also like to thank Ian Wright of English Heritage, as was Ben, actually, yes, now Historic England, who monitored the site during the fieldwork. And then when he moved on to better things, Jane Siddell took over, his boss anyway, in the post-excavation phase, and was greatly instrumental, actually, in getting us the funding from Harrow Borough Council to publish the article that is in Lammas. So I'm grateful to all of those. So basically, we had a job that involved mostly the area of the outer court, but also limited amounts of work, which were meant to be only single trenches, I may say, on the moated island. Just very briefly, I'm starting with the outer court where most of our work was meant to be. That is, of course, the great barn, and dendrochronology has shown that it was built in the 16th century. It doesn't therefore actually date back, at least in any of the surviving parts, to the medieval period, but nevertheless, it is an important listed building in its own right. Moving south, we're standing actually on the roof of the manor house because they had scaffolding up while they were doing their improvements, which is a great help for these shots. And that is the granary. The granary doesn't, however, come from the original complex. It was brought to the site in the later 20th century from elsewhere. It is an 18th century granary, but it was brought in, though there was an earlier granary in a similar position in the earlier manor. And on the left, the small barn. And the small barn, imaginatively named, is nevertheless the only place where significant archaeology had taken place until very recently. And in 1987, I think it was a fire, and while they were about to restore it, Stephen Tucker undertook an excavation there, and under the floor, and this is in Lammas 37, I think it is, 1987, there is an account of what he found. And in sum, what he found was that in phases 2 and 3, there were 15th to 17th century remains under the floor, post holes, stake holes, a gully or two. There was a tiny bit of 13th century pottery. Well, he calls it 13th century. It may have been a local type that was current in the 13th and 14th centuries. And then in the 18th century, this may have been a drain, by the way, because in the 18th century, a brick drain was added running through that end of the building. And an eroded area here was thought to suggest that there was a doorway or an opening on this side of the building. And these are the timber foundations of the later barn that was restored. So there are a number of historic maps that tell us about what was on the site. And clearly the 3 buildings we have now were not the totality of what was in the outer court, or indeed on the manor house in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The historic maps, the early ones, are, as is almost always the case, very approximate. They don't give you all the detail. Roke in particular is known for leaving whole buildings out sometimes, and in this case he didn't even show the moat, so that was pretty good, though we're pretty sure it was there before 1760. However, what is clear is there's the Great Barn with a building behind it and a sort of covered out shot. Another barn, not the small barn that we have, which was there, and which must have either been moved or temporarily taken down and replaced in the later 19th century, and more buildings. That's probably the granary, and a line of buildings here that Molas have been examining together with the volunteer team. This was in the 2013-14. I don't know whether it's been going on since, because I'm afraid my involvement ended in 2017 when Oxford's work finished. But I know they found a long sequence of post-medieval activity of what were probably both tenements for workers and also craft shops and things like that, activities like that going on there. But I'm not going into that. There are reports online of all of this background information. Starting in the outer court, what we found was not, to be honest, much more interesting than we had expected. The only potentially early building would have a bit of a problem with the share and stop share. Can we? No, all right, okay. Well, up there in that corner, we found the corner of a stone walled building. And here, a jumble of stone that might nevertheless, very badly damaged, that might, lovely, that might just have represented the remains, as I say, cut through by the service trenches of another wall. And looking at that, yeah, doesn't like it now, does it? Let's try a different approach. No.
Click back on the presentation screen. No, that just on the main screen.
Right. Hurrah. So here is the stone wall, the corner of it, and the robber trench where it was removed. And the interesting thing is it's largely flint, but there's some chalk in there as well. And on the outside of it is a yellow clay. And that will be a theme of what I have to talk about, because it's butted up. It's not cut through, it's butted up against the building. And I forgot to mention that what Tucker said was underneath the 15th century levels in the small barn was a 20-centimetre deep, 20-inch deep layer of redeposited clay. So it looks as if in the outer court there may have been some degree of embanking of the area of occupation, possibly from the digging of the moat or of the ponds that are also known on the site, at an early stage of its history. Right, otherwise, the results were largely much what we had anticipated. Pebble surfaces of the 18th and 19th centuries and brick demolition layers from the demolition of buildings that had formerly stood on the site. Here we see, near to the small barn, chalk layers not associated apparently with buildings. There were large spreads of chalk, and we couldn't, if there were surfaces to them, which I imagine there must have been, they must have been truncated in the past. There's one here and another long stretch outside the Great Barn. And then in the middle, outside the granary and in other places, we found patches of brick floor, presumably in this case, possibly relating to the old granary, but we found so little that we couldn't make a lot of sense of it. In one case, here, you can see two brick walls, the remains of, with a chalk floor in between them. So this is a little more coherent. And that was, in fact, the end of this building. And it was nice, therefore, to be able at least to provide a sort of feeling for what that building had been like, how it had been constructed, though we weren't able to say much more about it in the small trenches we dug. So some information of interest, and indeed, in the trench with the stone wall back of the Great Barn, we found a few sherds, 2 or 3 sherds of 13th, 14th century pottery, but not, unfortunately, in the wall itself, in the robber trench, and so it was difficult to know where they had come from. As well as the discoveries, limited discoveries made relating to the buildings, that wall there, I should say that on the historic maps, the Great Barn, it may be a factor of just poor draftsmanship, but the Great Barn from the 19th century maps does appear to have expanded slightly and contracted at one end or the other, particularly at this end. So I'm not saying that that stone wall is necessarily prior to the Great Barn as is. It could be an earlier incarnation of the building rather than an entirely earlier medieval building, though it still might be. As well as the little bits of building we found and surfaces, note that there are quite substantial ponds in the outer court area. This one, which changes shape and size, this one again the same, but we were to find that there were even more areas of pond in the past than are on these maps. This is a rather scrappy map of the early 19th century with the modern map superimposed and the trenches. And just here, just outside the small barn, we were to find something that in the end resulted in this straight trench being diverted around it and provided the evidence for significant new ponds. And this was what we found. It was a line of substantial timbers along the very edge of the trench, and then a plank sort of parallel to them, and then lighter timbers on the other side. And a line also at right angles, but not a full line because that one's a bit off key. And it appeared that the ground sloped down on that side and on this side quite steeply. And it looked as if this was revetting some sort of a bank between two deeper areas, probably ponds. Most of what we found was backfill, and that was of post-medieval date. So it was difficult, really, to be sure what we were dealing with in terms of date. But I'll show you a few slides. This is as first uncovered, with the plank very visible. These are the posts, they're not terribly clear, and these are the smaller posts on this side. And the slope coming down on this side is fairly clear. You can see the fills here, the dark pond-like fills. And that's another view, which I think is a little clearer about the two parallel rows of timbers. And when we started, we didn't, I might point out that our whole remit was not to excavate large areas. Neither Historic England wanted large-scale excavations, nor was the Heritage Lottery Fund interested in doing more than was appropriate to get the job done. So we did not end up excavating this area extensively. But we did strip a little bit to show that these were very substantial timbers, slightly angled, as if they were indeed revetting the bank. And there were dark soils which produced waterlogged plant remains from them. At the end, at the top end, there was patches of chalk on the top of this bank, as if it had been intended as a surfaced something, and there were even the odd brick on top of it, though nothing that we call a proper surface. But you see they're quite substantial. And we cut a machine slot through just to have a look and show that they were quite deep, continuing down, and that there was indeed, this is not natural. It's not, it is a mixture of natural and redeposited material. And so it is, in fact, possibly interspersed between what was once a larger area of ponding. Looking then away from the main structure, which is here, towards the small barn, here is a little bit of a timber, a stone platform, and another timber appearing. And that timber, when we diverted the area, we took out and dendrochronologically dated. The date was a little bit disappointing in that it was 1709 to 10, i.e. early 18th century, yet most of the finds from the backfilling suggested the same date. So it was a little odd that we had the backfilling at the same time as the date of the felling of this timber. But as I said, we're not sure that this dates the whole of the structure. It could well have been an addition, particularly as it was close to the small barn. So we think, but what you can see in this slide is a cut here where all these deposits, which had the wall on top, the platform on top, are cut away deep again for pond fills. So what we're saying is that not only down here and here, where the historic maps show us ponds, but also in this area, there was another sizable pond with only a narrow gap, perhaps, for crossing in the 17th, 18th centuries. This isn't that surprising because although now the main access to the site is here, in the past it was always to the north, northwest. Anyway, so some interest in terms of the extent of ponding and a hint perhaps of a medieval structure. Moving on to the moated island. And here, I haven't really said anything about this site, so I want to talk a little bit about the standing building. I'm not going to be saying anything more about the standing building this evening. My work was below ground, and it's an area beyond my area of expertise, I have to say. I'm grateful to David and Barbara Martin, who wrote a very comprehensive summary of the history of the development of the building, from dendrochronology done by them and others, and by a review of all the standing building evidence. And they came up with this simplified sequence. So basically, documentary evidence suggests that the building was constructed in the early 14th century. We have some documents referring to Walter de la Hague, dated around 1300. The first owner after that was almost certainly the person who built the manor house. And then it went via Robert Wodehouse, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer for a while, to the Archbishops of Canterbury, and in particular Stratford, who made it his principal residence in the late 14th century, northwest of London. And the dendrochronology has usefully shown that from the timbers felled, which are again 1310 to 25, it's likely it was built in the 25 to 33 period when it's supposed to have been built. What you can see in solid outline is the original building that survives today. So both the building to the north, which was thought potentially to be a kitchen, it was not known, but it was just suspected that was where it was, and this area at this end, thank you, which is the extension of the hall, now demolished, and a big block assumed to be the solar and the private chambers of the owners have all gone. In the 16th century, in period B, the yellow shows that a substantial wing was built extending northwestwards from the main building, which consisted, by the way, of half a hall and a cross wing, basically the service wing and passage, of the medieval manor. But a wing was built extending north, which in its 16th century incarnation was probably not a kitchen. We're not certain, but it's unlikely because it doesn't appear to have had a big chimney. Whereas by the 17th century, it had acquired one and almost certainly became the kitchen of the integrated manor house. And the supposed old kitchen had gone. So much for that. I'm not going to go into the details of what happens afterwards because, quite frankly, it's very complex. And as I say, and there are many arguments about whether all of it is true or part of it is true. I'll simply say that it's generally thought that this survives to the very end of the 17th century and then disappears. This is the simplified view of what Pat Clark, who basically did all the documentary work most people would need for this site and published it in Lammas in 2000. And I'm very grateful for her, both for that information, but also for my help with historic maps and for a photograph you will see shortly. But she was pointing out, there's the cross passage, buttery and pantry. This is the surviving bit of the hall. And this is the most simplest view that imagined it as two aisles with this private wing at the other end. What did we find? Well, this is a summary of everything that we found. And I'm going to deal first with the area to the north of the standing manor and then come to this bit later on. Almost as soon as we started digging this trench, we came across walls close to where the bridge is, and I'm not going to talk about them anymore except to say that they may relate to the gatehouse. We know there was one by the end of the medieval period. Documents tell us quite a lot about it, about the buildings, but not in detail. But we know no more than that. And then as we got further north, we came across further buried walls at very shallow depth. To the south, we really hadn't expected to go beyond here, but a stripping of topsoil revealed yet more walls, and so we ended up doing yet further work there. So this is as we're just digging away from the bridge, and as you can see, walls are appearing truncated by the services in the sides of the trench. And in this example in particular, you can see a large amount of yellow clay either side of the wall, and in some cases extending a later layer extending over it. We had no dating for these walls, so we didn't know what we were dealing with at that point. All we knew was they weren't of the brick character of many of the 18th, 17th, 18th century post-medieval buildings, so they could have been quite early. This is the area that was stripped once we hit with our trench this bit of stone, and then another area of stonework here. It was decided that we'd better strip an area and see what we were actually looking at. Initially, what we uncovered was stone paved, well, cobbled areas, tile incorporated, 18th, 19th century, possibly late 17th. But it was clear that this was something substantial, as was this bit of wall here. And this is a detail of the bit on the north, showing this wall continuing well below the level of the late surfaces. We cleaned it up. This is the wall we were looking at before, this one here, a short wall. We took it back and revealed a wall at right angles to it, which was more substantial than this one, and built of a mixture, a much stronger mixture of chalk and flint. And this is it looking back again at that short wall, which we were able to show was not continued by this apparent wall on top, but ended here. So it was some sort of stub of a wall, only a couple of meters long, but this major wall, which was going on down below the level of the bottom of this wall, well below it, and a construction level for that wall with chalk and odd bits of flint upon it. Once this persuaded Ian Bright that we needed to open a few holes to find out what was going on. The man sitting recording is on that short wall. That's the long wall we started to uncover. That's where the rubble was we found towards the corner. And we had indeed got two sides of a very substantial building. And so we cleaned up the corner and opened up these two trenches to try and understand rather more what was happening. This is just a shot of the corner to show it widens and has particularly large cornerstones, a crude but very substantial way of construction. The two trenches we opened revealed a very deep wall indeed. It was nearly well, you'll see in a second, and a mixture mainly made of chalk, but with a certain amount of flint, particularly in the upper part, and crudely dressed quite a long way down, and then not so much dressed towards the bottom. And this is an angle view to show you it is 1.5 meters or more up. And at the bottom, we think we found, it's the only place where we might have found natural clay. But above it, you'll see there's a thick layer of clay. And then on this horizon, we found traces of charcoal and a little bit of flint, as if something had happened at this level. And then a great bank of further clay coming up almost to the stripped level, which was not more than 20 or 30 centimeters below ground level. And that's just confirming that view of the deep stratigraphy. The second trench, and I'm now looking we were looking down back to that corner. So I'm on the outside here, and that's the inside. And here, halfway down the wall, similar width and character, we found a very distinct horizon of flint chippings and chalk, which we are almost sure is a dressing layer, where they had stopped to dress the wall before they oddly continued to dump more clay against it. And there is a view of that wall from the outside, fully revealed. And the reason I put that up was to show that the pattern of only chalk at the bottom and flint higher up is not so straightforward, because there's flint almost all the way down here. It's obviously something that wasn't an absolute rule of thumb. It was something where you used what you got to do what you needed. Once we got that, we wondered what we were dealing with. The problem was that we had no dating to speak of. In fact, the only dating we did have was fragments of tile. And they were tiles of a sort that our tile specialist, who's very experienced, said were probably 15th to 17th century, well, no, 16th to 17th century, post-medieval. And they were right down at the bottom of our wall in one or two cases. It wasn't quite right. But I realized that, in fact, 2 or 3 small holes have been dug by the Centre for Archaeology inside the building, up against the walls of the timber frame surviving medieval manor house. And they had shown a very significant flint and chalk wall with a layer of nap flints part of the way up. So a construction method and type very similar to ours, and in their cases covered by the 14th century timber framing of the standing building. So we felt we ought to have a medieval building, but it was this lack of other dating evidence that made it difficult to be certain, especially as in none of these holes dug below the building had they found any independent dating evidence in terms of pottery or radiocarbon dates. So anyway, we decided to persevere. Ian was persuaded to open, we'd had a look at these two in that corner, to open another trench here to look at the relationship between our building and the standing manor, and also to see if we could trace it any further. And so we opened a trench here, and in doing so, we were able to show that it returned short of the standing manor. And we picked it up again when we cleaned up this service trench, because this service that was meant to go through there was diverted when they had exposed these walls to avoid damaging them. And fortunately for us, went across the middle. So although it didn't go very deep, we did get a chance to draw a section across the building. We also, and I'm afraid I can only call it wall chasing really, because all we were doing was exposing the tops of the walls. We didn't have either resources or the time or the money to do any more. But we did establish that it was a building some 9 meters wide and 19 meters long at least, and sitting very much where the kitchen was, medieval kitchen was supposed to be. So this is the building, this is the trench close to the standing manor house with its 18th century facing, and the wall there of the earlier 16th century range. See the flints there at the end there, just poking out. And this was the corner. And there, the building is turning before, unfortunately, a relationship with the standing building. So no joy there. But looking at it, just to make it very clear, we're looking back now between the two southwards. But we then we realized when I was talking later to Pat Clark about the building, she said, oh, well, in 1987, when Stephen Tucker was digging under the small barn, he had watched the excavation of some service trenches in this area. And in doing so, he had exposed a wall on the line of our wall, continuing right up against the latest extension of the modern standing manor. And this was it. So Pat was able to demonstrate to us that that wall continued right the way up to and beneath the standing manor house. I'll come back to that in a minute. On the other side, away from the standing manor, we traced this wall all the way from the corner past the original exposure up here and exposed the stub of a probable second short wall like the one we'd found under here. And this is the edge of that. We weren't able to follow it down, with a tiled area and a possible hearth next to it. We then followed the building, that wall we've had right the way past the end of that late extension. And there it was again, and again, going on beyond the end of the building. We don't know how far it goes, but it's clearly not a square building. It is some sort of rectangular complex. And to go back to the plan, so we have a major room here that we traced all this way, with that wall continuing. And we picked up, and although we only got 2 exposures, we're comfortable with that. And where this trench across the building went under the wall, we found a further cross wall here, which we are later to trace all the way up to here, with further occupation deposits on that side, inside that second room. So this is the corner across the building where that trench is coming. And here we were lucky enough to find the exposure of the edge of our main wall close to the building, and then a lovely tiled hearth, the pitch tile hearth, up against another cross wall, another short one, because it appears to end just here. So that was a nice in situ hearth in the corner of the main room. And then beyond it, the trench goes on under the wall, and you can't really see it there, but in the detail, there is another wall showing, yes, at the end, underneath the extension, much later than it, of the manor house in the 18th, probably late 18th century. So we're getting quite a good view. This is the same extension inside, and there we have the wall continuing northwards from where we saw it just back there under the doorway, and continuing, in fact, all the way through here. And there it is again, rather dim, I'm afraid, but there are a few stones left. But there is a nice dark charcoal-filled layer of occupation within the building, again, in the second room. So what do we make of all this? Well, as I say, the only dating we had from our building was 3 scraps of 2 or 3 gram sherds, which could all have been medieval, but that was not sufficient to really make a story. And the tile, which didn't quite fit, though I was suspicious by this time, after all, that corner tiled hearth looked very nice. Well, across the main room, we were able to clean up this section. You may see a dark band here showing, which was, in fact, an occupation level, that charcoal that went all the way onto the top of the tiled hearth. It clearly come from it and spread out in the hearth when it was used many times. And luckily for us, there was both the main layer of charcoal and below it here, a second clay layer, a floor layer with charcoal in it. And so we radiocarbon dated both the lower layer and the upper layer. Well, there were all sorts of potential problems. It could have been, the lower one could have been contaminated. They might have been, the dates could have been anything, but the dates were tremendous. The lower date gave us a range of 1290 to 1410, which is in effect the end of the 13th to the very beginning of the 15th century. So a building probably built in the 14th century, that was good enough for me. And the upper layer, which may represent one of the latest uses of the building, was firmly in the mid to late 15th century. So we had our medieval kitchen, and the odd thing about it was we had only one corner hearth, not the sort of kitchens you get in abbeys with their huge ovens, stone floors. We had thin occupation layers and nothing much else. So I was a bit confused at first. It wasn't what I, as it were, was used to. But I looked for local parallels, and at Northolt Manor, in the 14th century, this is the moated manor house, a suitable parallel, I think, in terms of date and character. And there, the kitchen began as a small square and then extended out very shortly into a second room and possibly a third. And here we have a detail, and there is only one hearth and middle central hearth in the kitchen itself, and then an oven in the bakehouse. And then outside, there's an enormous couple of tiled hearths. So much of the actual cooking must have been done under lean-tos outside the kitchen itself. And the kitchen is not filled with corner ovens and hearths, as you might expect. In addition, of course, abbey kitchens are used all the time, whereas a manorial kitchen like this one would have been used mainly when the Archbishop of Canterbury and his people visited, and occasionally when his bailiff came to check. But for much of the time, it was only held by tenants, and they didn't live in it. They apparently lived in the outer court, because there keep being these things saying, one of the conditions of your tenancy is you will live in the manor. So they clearly weren't. So I suspect this kitchen actually got relatively little use over time and was kept fairly clean. However, when did it end? Sorry, one of the odd things that came out of our work was all these massive walls and foundations, because it's a timber frame building, the main building, and in fact, there's no particular reason in terms of rubble why the kitchen could not have been timber framed on those stone foundations as well. So what is this method of construction? Well, one of the suggestions by Richard Bond, who looked at the cross wing at around 2000, was to suggest that there was only a low level of covering of clay from the moated island, and that it stood on a great plinth up to 1 metre high before the timbering. Well, this is all very well when you've got the main manor house as one block, but we had a kitchen about 15 metres away from the original manor house, also on a block. So did they have raised walkways, or did they have to go down steps every time they went across and up? I don't think so, and I think the evidence now suggests that the clay we found in the upper levels, even though it was up against the dress walls, was in fact further embanking to raise the whole level by a substantial amount. And that clay presumably came from the original moat, because we've got 14th century deposits dated on top of it. Moving on, and another final point about that embanking is that here is the wall again. Sorry, I keep pointing at my screen. Here is the wall again of the 16th century extension. And it sits right on top of all that clay. It's not cut into it in the slightest. And had that clay been a post-medieval change at the end of the life of the manor house, when it went private after the dissolution, that would have been still, however much they compacted it, I wouldn't have wanted to build a big new range on top of it. So I think it had been there for a long time. And I suspect that it had been all part of the original medieval moated embanking of the area inside the moat. One final comment on the date of disuse. We don't know when it went out of use. There are tiles of 17th century date hardly above the floor, so it could be it survived as late as the 17th century. There is no dating evidence other than what is either roof collapse or spread of demolition material before building yard surfaces. But we did find in the deposits that we sampled, as well as the date, the material, the charcoal, we found all these small mammal bones, and only a very small number were burnt. The rest were unburnt, which suggests to me that there were a number of rodents and birds and amphibians in the kitchen, the former kitchen, just wandering about, or brought in by owls and deposited on the floor as owl pellets. And this is very unlikely to happen while the kitchen was in use. So it's much more likely this relates to a period of disuse when the building was still open and before the roof had collapsed completely, and it just remained unused. Perhaps throughout the late 15th and much of the 16th century. I don't know. We just don't have any dating. Unfortunately, dating small mammal bones to get a radiocarbon date, though I would have loved to do it, I was told that it was almost certainly not going to work. There wouldn't be enough collagen. So that is a question for the future. How am I doing? That's brilliant. Turning to the south of the manor house, we really thought our job was pretty much over at this point, and we had a really important new discovery. But there was a service trench that came up to here, and And then they stripped this area to make a new garden, a new garden. And in doing so, they uncovered yet more walls. Now, going back to my general plan that comes from Pat Clark's article, her view was that it was probably a two-bay hall with a solar wing beyond it, which was a modest interpretation of the building. Perhaps similar to Low Hall at Walthamstow, where we have a separate kitchen, rather like ours. We have a cross wing, service wing, then we have a hall, and then a solar block at the far end, which was elaborated from a single room in the 14th century, right through the 15th century to a big range, which is the only bit that survived into the post-medieval period. At this site, the only work that had been done outside the manor house in terms of excavation was by the central unit in the 90s, when they dug these holes following a geophysical survey that suggested that there might be something in this general position in terms of a building. And what they found was they traced the robber trench of the hall all the way down to here. It was quite a small scale piece of work, and they didn't bottom very much. They cleared things, did a tiny bit of digging. And on the basis of that, they said, robber trench, carries on. There was an edge there that they thought was the robber trench. And then here there was another wall, slightly offset, carrying on all the way down to a much longer trench they dug, and a parallel wall here. So on the basis of that, Busby suggested that there was a huge 4-bay hall here. And so the situation lasted, although the Martins never believed it. So it remained like that. We found walls. We uncovered the biggest trenches, the corner trench they found walls here, and here, and here on the other side of the building. And that's, by the way, where the geophysical survey had suggested this other building. So I'm now going to very quickly talk you through what we found and what we think it means for the history of the hall and the solar range. And that's just a slightly better view, because I'm going to start up there, come down around here to here and here, and then I'm going to go back and have a look at this wall cutting through the later wall and this area outside here. So you can see the robber trench apparently coming all the way through to here. Here is our wall, not quite in line with the east side of the building, but that's not the hall, by the way. There are extra rooms added on. It's outside the line of the hall. But it's a wall very similar to the kitchen wall, though we weren't able to follow this wall down to any great depth. And up towards the other end, there was a widening, which we suspect was for a bench, or possibly for the base of some sort of outcrop, we don't know. And that wall went all the way down and then returned. And here you've got the corner cut away by a ditch, and those are the bricks of a late drain running, a post-medieval drain running across the corner, following the ditches. It then turns the corner, runs along the south. There's an end, there must have been a doorway of sorts. It narrows, that's later blocked, and carries on southwestwards. And the back of that wall, by the way, was badly robbed away. The interior of this building, whatever we found, has a complex history which we can't fully explain. All we can say is we were able to show outside there's this lovely yellow clay that we'd picked, yellow-brown clay, but same clay we'd found abutting the walls in the kitchen. On this side, it's a darker soil. I have to take my word for it with this dried out slide. And then we followed it on. There is the wall we saw before, carries on, and then it ends and turns a corner, returns. This is the wall that Busby found, which he thought was abutting the robber trench here of the hall. But this is terribly shallow. There's nothing to it. It's nothing like the walls of the hall we've seen that have been seen under the standing building. Whereas this is a great deep wall abutted by clay. Oh, sorry, so this is that nasty middle bit with the wall apparently narrowed at some point. Funny, good edge, but then it looks as if it's been narrowed above this level. perhaps robbing. And there's the wall that Busby found the end of, much further down. And here we have that corner. As I say, this trench here is too shallow to represent the whole wall. And this wall, which sits slightly offset anyway, didn't look right. And here is the return of the main wall, although it's terribly narrow, but that's because it's been robbed on the inside. And here we are, we dug a trench here to prove that indeed this was the medieval, probable medieval wall with its clay, and this sits on top of it. So this is a post-medieval 16th century or later wall. So what we can say from that is that the hall isn't as long as Busby thought. It's more likely to be a 2-bay hall than a 4-bay hall, but the walls did come down to where he wanted the hall to go, but it's all accommodation. It's the solar block, not the hall. Very quickly, beyond the end of our wall, we found, this is the drain I pointed out. I mentioned a drain there. This is it, well preserved, with a number of finds from the ditches that cut the corner, and then from the tile drain that show its mid to late 16th century. Nice bricks of 16th century character. There's some of them are glazed bricks of early time. This is the wall that cut through that building. You can see it cutting right the way through those walls. And if you see, this is where it is. So we're only a part way down. That's our return wall. But here, beyond that, we looked for a continuation. And that trench was very carefully placed. If the hall wall had come this far, we should have seen it in here. We didn't. What we saw was a continuation of this wall and something outside it. So here is that wall continuing, robbed in this case, but on its outside away from the building, there is this strange stone structure filled with dark fills. And there it is at an angle, and it's the stone lining, flint lining of a garderobe pit filled with later 16th century finds. So what we've got is a cross wall inside the level of where Busby's hall was, which is why I say it's 2-bay, a later addition shortening it in the 16th century, cutting short the original building and putting a garderobe on the outside of it. And that's just another view. And unlike Low Hall at Walthamstow, which I showed you before, where by the end of the 15th century, they built this extra range right by the moat. So your garderobe can, of course, drain down and into the moat. Ours is in the middle of the moated island, and there's no way that would have drained into the moat. Those ditches and that drain could have been intended initially to carry some of the overflow from that away. I don't know. We'll never really know the answer. So to summarize, we have some possibilities for the post-medieval history. Because of the limitations of what we were able to do, I'm not pretending that this does more than answer 1 or 2 questions and raise many more others. But what it does do is to suggest that we have an early medieval range where the kitchen may still have been surviving, but may not, may already have gone. And in that version, we think it might have gone already. And that the hall was definitely only two bays, and may have had chambers over with accommodation beyond it. The only reason I've speculated about this is because from the end of the 16th, early 17th century, we have the will in which the owner left to his wife quite a lot of the manor house and various buildings on the manor as well. And in doing so, it made it possible to identify a minimum of 9 or 10 rooms. And his sons also got some of the manor house, but it sounds like they got the rough end of the deal. But nevertheless, how do we fit all those in? So I'm merely saying, well, chambers could have been there, accommodation and gallery could have been here. Well, and that, by the way, appears to be a continuation going off, but where it goes, we don't know, because those were walls we couldn't follow. Alternatively, there's a gallery mentioned, and it's just possible that that long building that Busby found and that we found as well was some form of unusual ground floor gallery, or even possibly a first floor gallery, because it could have been timber framed above. It wasn't very substantial, but then you saw that the foundations of the West Range were only that deep in flint before they put the timber on top. So it's possible that the gallery extended down the garden, as it were, away from the manor, and that's where they walked when it was wet, because the manor house isn't enormous enough to have a very big gallery. Well, anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed, sorry, I don't need that one, I'll go back, enjoyed my little gallop through what we learned at Headstone Manor, and it's certainly been very enjoyable doing it. Thank you. I think the only last thing I'd like to say is that, of course, for those of you who've read the article we published, quite a lot of that and a good deal of more explanation that might make it more comprehensive